Hey, I'm Joy Axelson, and now we're going to be looking through Ecclesiastes 5 through 10. And I was just thinking about, have you ever been around people who are always so negative and just talk about how bad their life is and how sick they are and how nothing ever goes right for them? They are just so depressing and they just drain the life out of you. And some ways the preacher is a little bit like that in that he shows all the negativity and hopelessness in life. But there are sprinkles of hope in the book. So now let's first look at Ecclesiastes 5 verses 1 through 7. And this is a warning about what you do when you promise God something, and you need to carry through with what you promised God and not just talk about it, but to fear God. And it does picture God here as being in the heaven as the judge and man on earth. Some scholars view God here in this section as picturing God as being up there, as being remote, far off, and unattainable. In Ecclesiastes 5:2, the phrase where it says utter a word, that means the concept of to pray. And this takes place of the idea of somebody coming to the temple to bring their prayers. And also in verse 6 where it has the word messenger. When I first read it, I was like, what in the world is that? Well, it's actually, because the context of it is giving vows, and so it's most likely that the messenger here refers to giving vows before the priest. In the rest of the chapter, in verses 18 through 17, you have this picture of injustice in government and the futility of looking for satisfaction and fulfillment in money because it's going to be lost. And ultimately, there's no value because of death. There are so many examples of people in our world today who strive after wealth. They work so hard and so long and so many hours, but in the end they really don't find satisfaction in materialism or wealth. It's like they're endlessly working, but in the end there is no real satisfaction. Let's look at chapter 5 verse 18 through 20. And it says, "Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil which one toils under heaven, the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. Every one also to whom God has given wealth, possessions, and power to enjoy them, and to accept his lot and rejoice in this toil. This is the gift from God. For he will not remember the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with the joy in his heart." So here we have above the sun perspective of life and God, in contrast with the emptiness of wealth of the verses before this. So there is contentment, enjoyment possible when life is seen as a gift from God. God is the giver of wealth, possessions, and the power to enjoy them. And now we move on to chapter 6, and verse 1 turns again to the repeated word under the sun. So we go back to the human perspective. We see in this chapter different examples of people searching and longing after things but never being satisfied. There's a man who's not able to enjoy his wealth, but a stranger does. There's another man that has many children, but he doesn't have a burial, even though you would think after having so many children that they could provide for his burial. And it was such a shame in the Jewish society if you're not buried properly. So yeah, what a shame, what an end to him. And even at the middle and end of the chapter, it talks about the unending need for food. Even though you work, you always will be hungry. You always have to buy more food, so the appetite is never satisfied. And the preacher goes on to say that Well, because of all these things, it's better to be like a stillborn child who's never experienced life. It's better than this, because a man will always die unsatisfied. And just looking that chapter 6 verse 2 is in contrast to what the preacher said about God at the end of chapter 5 verse 19, where he said that God gives the power to enjoy possessions. But then in chapter 6 verse 2, the preacher says that God didn't give this man the power to enjoy his possessions, but a stranger did. So this is all just vanity and evil. So some interpret this to mean that man cannot know or understand God. So there's this huge gap between man and God. That God is just a remote ruler and that man is just helpless. But remember, this contrast can seem a bit confusing, but remember that the preacher sometimes shows different views of God, because he wants to show the different sides of different beliefs or perspectives. So this can cause tension when he looks at different viewpoints of different issues or different sides of how people see God or understand God. So sometimes there's an over the sun view of God, and sometimes there's an under the sun view of God. So I just want you to keep this in mind. And you know, this chapter 6 view of God is a very common view of God that the world has even today, that God is just out there somewhere, not able to comprehend who he is or what he does, that God really doesn't care about man. But we know in reality that God does very much. So moving on to chapter 7, verses 1 through 13, the preacher uses proverbs that show something is better than another thing. For example, when you look in verse 1, it says, a good name is better than precious ointment. So throughout these verses, something is better than something else. And through these verses, the preacher is looking at what is better for man. Is life better or is death better? And here the preacher emphasizes that death ultimately is better. Even though wisdom, he also looks at wisdom is better than foolishness, but man can't control anything, so what is the real value of wisdom? And this is implied in verse 13. Verses 5 through 6, backing up a little bit, the Hebrew here, let's see, 5 through 6, let's look at that. In verse 6 it says, for the cracking of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fools, and this is all as vanity. So this is actually a play on words in the Hebrew. Thorns and pots in Hebrew sound almost identical. So basically what the author is saying is the song or the laughter of the fools won't last long. They'll just be like thorns that burn up super fast. Let's look and read verses 15 through 18. In my vain life I have seen everything. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing. Be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you should take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand, for the one who fears God shall come from them both. And so here in verse 15, the preacher is coming against the common view of the wisdom literature of that time, which was the idea of retribution, that the wise or the righteous, these are synonymous words, would have a long life, whereas the wicked and the foolish would perish. But in reality, he says, nope, the reverse is true. The wicked have long life, where the righteous or the wise end up dying early. And in verses 16 through 17, the preacher gives two commands, which are warnings against excessive pursuit of righteousness or wickedness. And remember here that wisdom is synonymous with righteous and folly with wickedness. And so what is the solution to these things? Well, it's the rhetorical questions at the end of each of these verses, which he says destruction and ruin follow both extremes. But you have to really think about this. Is the advice the preacher is giving at this point, is it really true, and is it really godly to follow? Because is it not good to be righteous and wise? Something for you to think about. Remember that these are observations that the preacher has made from his human viewpoint. And some of the things that he says may not always be the best to follow, because it's just what he has seen in this earthly life. But verse 18, the key here is to fear God. The idea of coming out from them both is the idea of they will be successful, or the ones that fear God will be successful. Going on to the end of chapter 17, looking at 17 verse 19 through 8 verse 1, there's the main idea that all have sinned and guilty of cursing. And then he goes on in the next verses, to strive for wisdom is good, but it's unattainable. And the preacher uses a common example in the wisdom literature of a loose moral woman who is able to fool or to abuse those who are foolish, but the righteous are able to escape from her grasp. And he ends in verse 29 that God made humans upright, but it is they who sought their own way which led them away into foolishness. Chapter 8 emphasizes the powerlessness of the helpless and injustice in the world. The wicked seem to get away with their sins, and they're even praised. And we see that like in verse 1. No. That's verse 10. Where even they can go into the holy place and they are blessed, but the righteous have to leave. This is injustice, says the preacher. Let's read verse 12 and 13. He says, though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolong his life, yet, and this is one of the only times he says, I know, because usually he says, I perceive, or I have seen, but here he says, I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his life like a shadow, because he does not fear before God. So in this contrast, yet, even though the preacher doesn't understand everything, he believes that God is just, and the promise that it will be well for those who fear God. So this is again over the sun perspective of God and the emphasis of fearing God. Let's look at verse 14. It says, there is vanity that takes place on earth, that where there was righteous people, to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. So now he's going back to under the sun perspective. And so he goes to the opposite side of the argument of injustice to create tension. The verses before, it will be well for those who follow and fear God, but here he's like, oh, there's just injustice. It's all vanity. But he's again showing the other side of the argument. In verse 15, the conclusion is that wisdom cannot understand the unfairness and injustice in this life, so just enjoy life. this could be taken in a positive way or in a negative interpretation. Chapter 8, verses 16 through 17 emphasizes that there's no rest in man's never-ending labor. Man is unable to understand everything, even if he searches for all the answers with great effort. And even wise men who claim that they know the ways of God and that they can explain the ways of God well, in reality they can't. Then chapter 9 and verses 1 through 10. Most of this chapter is under the sun viewpoint, that man cannot control his own fate. All are the same, all will die, death is best. I'm not going to go into great details in these verses, but just looking at verses 4 through 5, there's little hope. Here it seems like, maybe there's hope because the dog is going to live even though the lion is not. But if you really look at it, in that society, dogs were a despised animal. Even though this dog is living, he's despised in the culture. In some ways he seems better, but the royal lion, who would have been seen as a royal animal, is dead. But in reality, it doesn't matter if the dog is alive and the lion is dead, because in the end, all will die. So the dog has no advantage. And again, in chapter 9, verse 10, there is somewhat of the idea that the preacher sees it. There's no afterlife in his viewpoint under the sun. And then chapter 9, verse 11 through 10, verse 20, even though wisdom is good in the end, the preacher says it isn't really heard or applied, and it can even be destroyed by a little sin or foolishness. So in the end, wisdom doesn't have any advantage either. Sometimes we think that we have our own wisdom, that we can figure out our own problems, and if we really examine and look, we see over and over how we cannot figure out things in our own way or our own understanding, but we need God's wisdom and not man's wisdom. So there is hope in God's wisdom.